This is a 1991 Honda Civic Si, and it is a hot hatchback from a different era. This car has only 108 horsepower, so it's not exactly a Ford Focus RS, but it's still a fun car aimed at driving enthusiasts. It is basically impossible to find one of these in nice shape, but I have done just that. And today, I'm going to review this Civic Si. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my new online enthusiast car auction website with live auctions of cool enthusiast cars from the modern era, everything from the 80s and up. Right now on the site we have this live for auction, and also this, which is very cool, and also this and many more cars. So if you're looking to sell or buy a cool car from the modern era, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. I've borrowed this Si from a viewer here in the San Diego area, and I'm going to start with a little history. Now, the exact origin of the hot hatchback is a bit disputed, but most people think it started in the mid to late 1970s with the original Volkswagen GTI. Honda jumped in on the hot hatchback fun in the early 1980s with the original Civic Si, which had 91 horsepower. That's not a huge amount, but then again, the original GTI had just over 100 horses. The fourth generation Honda Civic debuted for the 1988 model year, and that meant the arrival of a new version of the Si, and that would be this. Enthusiasts refer to this as the EF generation of the Civic Hatchback. And the Si was undoubtedly the performance king in the lineup. 108 horsepower might not sound like much, but this car only weighed 2,300 pounds. By comparison, a new Civic weighs just under 3,000 pounds. A lot of equipment has been added over the years with luxury features and safety features and new technology. But this car had none of that. It's a tremendously basic hatchback with only the essentials. And the base model version of this car had only 92 horsepower. So 108 was a treat. The Si also got a few other upgrades over the base Civic, which I will show you, but it wasn't much. One of them was a tachometer. Unfortunately, the US market Civic Si wasn't quite as potent as the one sold in Japan, which had up to 130 horsepower. But this car was still pretty cool, and today I'm going to check it out. An incredibly rare, well-preserved example of the EF Civic Si hatchback. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of this car and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Civic Si with getting in and opening the door. The weird thing here is the seatbelt is mounted on the door. And it's not one of those electronic seatbelt systems that some cars had in this era. It's just a normal seatbelt, but they put it on the door instead of on a fixed point on the car. This is a very unusual thing. Certainly you don't see it that often, and it seems kind of unsafe. If you're in an accident and the door flies open or off, or maybe that's ridiculous. But it still is just so strange to see a seatbelt fully mounted on the door. Now, the reason they did this is the door is massive relative to the size of this car in order to allow rear passengers to get in easier. And so if they had mounted the seatbelt further back, you just wouldn't have been able to reach it. So instead, they put it there on the door. What a strange place for it. Now, one funny result of this seatbelt door situation is that in the gauge cluster, the warning light letting you know your seatbelt is unbuckled is the same as the warning light letting you know your door is open, because I guess they figure if the door is open, the seatbelt pretty much has to be unbuckled, so why not combine it into one warning light? Honda was all about simplicity 30 years ago, and I think that's funny. The old door seatbelt combo warning light. And next up, speaking of the seat belts and the seats, the driver's seat has been changed in this car. It's pretty much the only thing in this entire vehicle that isn't original, but the passenger seat is original. This is how the seat looked in the Civic Si. It got a sportier, more heavily bolstered seat than the regular Civic to keep you in place when you were going around those sharp turns with your 108 horsepower. Now, if you're wondering about the color of the seat and the interior in general, well, look no further than the passenger door jamb, where there is a decal that specifically says "off black," telling you precisely what color Honda calls your interior. Imagine sticking an interior color decal like this in modern cars. It would never fly. It would look totally unprofessional, but back then, well, your interior color was on a decal in your door jamb. It's just what they did. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. I want to go back to the door panel. There are still a few quirks here worth mentioning. For one thing, this car has manual mirrors, no surprise. You have this little lever coming off the mirror, and you just kind of adjust it to place the mirror exactly where you want. This car also has crank windows, so you crank the window and that's how it goes up or down. Pretty common of cars from this era, especially a lightweight kind of basic hatchback like this one. The reason I mentioned that though is this car has a power sunroof. This little button to the left of the steering wheel, you can press it and the sunroof automatically opens, or of course if you press it in the other direction, then the sunroof automatically closes electronically, so it has a powered sunroof. You can probably see why I think this is strange. This car has manual windows but a power sunroof. Of course, you'd think it'd be the other way around. You use the windows a lot more frequently than the sunroof, so you'd think you would want power windows and a manual sunroof, but that's not what they did. What a strange decision. And also in that vicinity, you have insanely simple sun visors. Over on the driver's side, it is just a sun visor. Put it down, that's all it is, that's all you get. Over on the passenger side, put it down, you get a mirror, but there's no light in there, and the driver has no mirror at all. It was a sun visor and nothing else. And indeed, that simplicity with the sun visors is carried over to basically everything in this interior. Nothing is more than it needs to be. You look around this interior and you can see everything is basic and simple. There are no extraneous lines or style or design anywhere. This car only has the necessities, everything you needed, and literally nothing more. It was just a very simple car, except the performance version of a very simple car. And you can see in the middle, this car still has the original radio, which is really, really impressive. Throughout the 90s, everybody was swapping head units. It was a common trend, but the owner of this car kept this radio. And you can see they called it the Honda 1000. To really drive home the point of just how great it was. You had a cassette player and 6 presets in the Honda 1000. Not bad. Now above the radio you have the climate controls, and again, very basic, everything you need, a dial and a few levers. One interesting thing about the climate controls though, there is a separate control for the driver to allow in outside fresh air for just the driver's vent. To the left of the steering wheel, this little vent only controls the driver's side vent for fresh air. The other vents are all controlled by this lever in the center, but for some reason that doesn't work for the driver's side one. You had your own control. Maybe the only kind of extraneous thing in this entire car. And next up, another simple item in here. In the center, you have the clock, which looks like all Japanese car clocks in the 90s. The thing I like is the clock adjustment. You want to change the clock, there's no menu or button on your turn signal stalk you have to figure out. Instead, you just put down this little door next to the clock, and there are your buttons to change it. But they're behind this door, so that you don't accidentally change the clock. You had a little clock button changer door. Pretty smart thinking. Also simple in this car, the door locks. You can see when they're unlocked, they're red with a little arrow telling you which way to push it to lock it. And then when you push it that way, it says locked, so you know it's locked. They don't necessarily look all that good with the bright red and the word lock printed there, but they're very functional, and that was the whole point. Also, another notable item in here, you can see the parking brake in the center, and on either side there's a giant red warning label that says emergency release for seatbelt is located on buckle. Yeah, do they mean the press button? We already knew that. You didn't have to tell us, Honda. And even if they mean something else, what are we going to be in a crash and a fire and I'm going to read that and then try to figure out what they mean? It's such a strange place for a bright red warning label, but they've put it there on both the driver and the passenger sides. And next up, we move on to the back seat in the Civic Si. And getting back here is surprisingly easy. A large gap is opened up when you move the front seat forward. There's just not all that much pillar or side crumple zone that you have to deal with, so it's pretty easy to get in back, even for someone pretty tall like me. Now, as you might expect, the back seat is also very basic and simple. No surprise given what we've just seen up front, but it is unusually basic and simple by modern standards. For instance, there's no headrest back here. It's not that they've been removed. They never existed in the first place. That whole neck whiplash situation hadn't really been fully thought out by the time this car came out. Rear headrests were deemed not entirely necessary. But beyond the lack of headrest, there's more to talk about back here. For instance, there's a little storage cubby to the right of the back seat over on the passenger side where you can put stuff. I mention this as interesting because there isn't a storage cubby on the left, on the driver's side. They've only put it on the right. Only one rear passenger needs to store stuff in the back of the Civic Si. But my very favorite thing back here is undoubtedly the windows. By modern standards, these rear windows are absolutely huge, massive things. With no side impact beams or side airbags that have to go in here, these windows can really be huge. And so the visibility is incredible back here. You feel like you're in an open vehicle, basically. It's unbelievable how big these windows are. I had forgotten how big late 80s, early 90s cars had their windows. You can see everything. Now, another interesting item with these windows is that they open. They don't roll down, that would be impossible because the wheel is there, but they do open out just a couple inches. You can push them open and get a little vent and air come through. The weird thing though is the latch for the windows is all the way back behind the cargo area. So if you're actually sitting in the back seats, you can't really reach the latch to open the back windows. You have to do that through the cargo area before you start driving. It's hilarious, but at least they open a little bit. There was some comfort provided for rear seat passengers. And next up, we move on to the back of the Civic Si, where there are a few quirks worth noting. But before I do that, for one thing, just again, look at how much glass there is. You can see from your angle, there's just so much visibility in this car. You can see so much. It's really impressive, especially by modern standards with rising window lines that make cars a lot harder to see out of. But anyway, on to the back of the Civic Si. One thing you notice back here immediately is this light bar that goes across the entire back. The center part doesn't light up, it's just there for show, but it does have a big light bar going across the entire car, which was a big trend in the late 80s and early 90s, and it's becoming a big trend again. Reminder that everything is cyclical. But anyway, you want to get into the cargo area in the Civic Hatch. There's a little keyhole back here, off center, just kind of sticking out, not placed very thoughtfully, but it's there. This was Honda in the late 80s and early 90s. Didn't have to look good, it just had to be functional and work. And indeed that does. Anyway, you stick the key in, you twist it, and then it unlocks and you can open up the hatch and get into the back of your Civic Si. Anyway, once you're back here, you see a few interesting things. One is this cargo cover, which obviously keeps your stuff private when you have stuff back here and you park the car and walk away. One cool thing about this cargo cover is it folds in half. So you can put stuff in it and then fold it right back over to cover up your stuff. A clever little Honda Civic Si solution. Other interesting items back here. One is you have a light, but it doesn't come on automatically when you open up the hatch. Instead, there's a little switch, you have to turn it on. So when it's dark and you want to get something out of your cargo area, you open it up, turn on the light like you would in your basement, and then you can find it. Next up, another notable item back here. Underneath the floor, you can see this car has the world's most pathetic spare tire. Unbelievably tiny, but of course, that's all it really needed. It wasn't exactly a very large car with very large regular tires either. Now, one item especially worth noting, there's not all that much space back here. This is not an especially large cargo area, nor an especially practical place for large items. You can can fold down the rear seats, which helps, but back here behind the seats, there's not all that much room. That's because this car is not all that big. I told you before it only weighs 2,300 pounds, and in terms of length, it's about as long as a Mini Cooper today, much shorter than a current Honda Civic, but this is how they looked back then. Now, with that said, you do have a little extra storage space back here. There's a little cubby next to the cargo cover where you can put stuff, except why would you want to put anything there? It's just going to bounce around when you're driving along and bounce right out of there, but it exists. And unlike the back seat, it exists on the other side too. So you have two extra shallow storage cubbies in back in case you want them for some reason. And next up, we move up front under the hood, and the first thing you notice when you open the hood is this label up front and center proudly announcing that this car was built by Honda of Canada Manufacturing Incorporated. That's right, this vehicle, which comes from kind of the heyday of early Japanese cars, was built in Canada. Believe it or not, Honda was already building in Canada by then, but the Canadians clearly did a good job with it since it's still on the road. And of course, the other important item under here is the engine. The Civic Si had a 1.6 liter four-cylinder as opposed to the mere 1.5 liter engine in the other Civics of its day. Now, I mentioned earlier that the base model Civic from this era had about 90 horsepower. That wasn't strictly true. There was a base model Civic with 75 horsepower, but virtually nobody got that one. Most people got the 90 horsepower version, or if you wanted performance, you stepped up to the 108 horsepower Civic Si. Now 108, not a huge number, especially by today's standards, and it's a far cry from the current Civic Si with 205 horsepower, but it was something. It was the beginning of the performance Civic. By the way, one other thing I like under here is this big label that says PGM-FI, and it makes you think it's some special new technology they've put in this engine to make it way better. But then you look and it actually stands for programmed fuel injection. PGM-FI, programmed fuel injection. It's not really anything special at all. They've just given it a weird acronym to make it seem special. Nice work. Now, beyond the engine, I want to discuss some of the other upgrades that the Civic Si had over the standard Civic. Now, earlier I mentioned tachometer. That was one of the benefits you got when you got the Si. You also got a clock in the interior, the one I showed you before. That was an option on the regular Civic, but it was standard on the Si. Same deal with a passenger side mirror. This was not mandated by the government at the time. It was optional on this era of Civic, but it was standard on the Si. The performance car needs two exterior mirrors. Now, the other upgrades were more performance-oriented than that. One is larger wheels, and these are those wheels. Most Si models had hubcaps on top of these steel wheels, but this was the steel wheel underneath a 14-inch wheel, larger than the standard Civic, 185 width tires. Seems pretty pathetic by modern standards, but that was the time period, frankly. As for the other upgrades, Civic Si models also had front and rear anti-roll bars for a little better handling, a little less body roll, and they had the seats, like I showed you before, those slightly grippier, heavily bolstered sports seats to keep you in place when you were flying around corners with your 108 horsepower. And so those are the quirks and features of the 1991 Honda Civic Si. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Civic Si. Now, one thing worth noting, the Civic Si also had a larger exhaust compared to the standard Civic. The exhaust in this one was replaced, so I didn't show it, but that was another benefit over the regular model. Now, one special thing about this car, it does not have power steering. Manual steering. Now, manual steering is often very annoying because it can get very heavy and cumbersome, but in the case of this car, it only weighs 2,300 pounds. It's not really all that difficult, and of course it contributes to a feeling of the road a lot more than cars with power steering. Well, it isn't fast. That is for sure. Certainly doesn't feel like a fast car, but the thing about this car and the thing that makes this car cool is it feels like a fun car. Woo! very little body roll because there's really not all that much body to roll, and an unbelievable directness to the steering that just isn't really available in modern cars today. It's so small and it's manual steering and it's so light. You just feel like you're so connected to this car. That term, you know, go-kart, like a go-kart, it's so overused, but this car has some of that feel to it because it really is that size and that level of maneuverability. Now, obviously you want to hear the story about how this car came to exist. The current owner is the second owner. He bought it off the original owner who had bought it new in '91, owned it for years, put 177,000 miles on it. This is the nicest 177,000 mile car in the world. And then it got to a point he got too old, couldn't use the car anymore, and the current owner found it. It was like a family friend, and he bought it from him. Obviously, there's so few of these in this kind of condition around that he understands kind of the specialness of it, and I implored him, please keep it stock, don't mod it like everybody else did in the 90s, because these were really hot tuner cars back then, and people modded them and street raced them and engine swapped them, and that was fun and all that, but now there's like none left except for this one. This car does have a 5-speed manual, which kind of surprised me considering how early it is. The owner told me that the basic Civics at the time had a 4-speed, but that the SIs had a 5-speed. Really, I love this car because it's just so simple and so basic and so to the point of what a hot hatchback should be. I love the Focus RS and the Golf R. They're great cars. And they're very capable, well-rounded vehicles, but they've obviously lost the plot from sort of the original hot hatch thing. Now, if you made a car like this today, no one would buy it. Nobody wants a car with no features, 2,300 pounds. Even enthusiasts who say they do, you give them that in actuality, they don't want to crank their own windows, they don't want no air conditioning, no power steering. But it is cool to at least revisit that and kind of see what it was like, where it started, and to see how a 2,300 pound car feels when you throw it around corners and drive it around. That's neat, and that's enjoyable. The closest thing to this car today is the Fiesta ST, and it gets relatively close, but it's amazing how different it still feels. This car is just so much more basic and simple and connected to the road, and you just feel like it's such an original, simple hot hatch, and I really, really love that aspect of it. This car is just fun, even though it's not the fastest car in the world. And so that's the 1991 Honda Civic Si. This isn't the fastest car, nor is it the best equipped car. In fact, it's kind of the opposite, but it is really cool, and it gives us some insight into where the high-performance Honda hatchback started. All of the ones that followed up to today's Civic Type R, this is the older brother of all of them. It is amazing to find this car in this condition, and it was great to spend the day with it, and now it's time to give this Civic Si a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Civic Si is fine, nowhere near beautiful. It had a very functional design, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Acceleration, 0 to 60 is 7.5 seconds, which gives it a 1 out of 10, although I swear it feels faster. Handling is reasonably sharp, but given the small tires and front-wheel drive, it's no sports car, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Fun factor is decent. This car feels quick and tossable and exciting, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Cool factor is higher. Finding one of these in nice shape is totally crazy, and I would freak out if I saw it. It gets a 6 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 19 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. This car has only the basics, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Comfort is okay. It's not particularly comfortable or plush, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Quality is fine. These are known for long-term reliability, but they aren't exactly nice or luxurious. It splits the difference with a 6 out of 10. Practicality is also a bit mixed. These have good cargo room for their size, but they're small cars with small back seats, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Finally, value, and this is a fun, reliable Honda that should be cheap, but prices are going up. The secret seems to be out for well-kept, sporty, older Hondas, and they're getting more expensive. I suspect this would be approaching a $10,000 car at this point, or it will be soon. That gives it a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 24 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 43 out of 100, which places it here against some sort of relevant cars. I haven't reviewed any direct rivals to the Civic Si, but I'm thrilled I had the chance to review this car. It's absolutely impossible to find them in this condition anymore, and it's amazing to experience. And it's no wonder these older Hondas are getting more valuable.